Ladies and gentlemen, my greetings to you. I wish to firstly thank the Open University of Mauritius for giving me this opportunity to speak in the context of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, which is commemorated every year on 30th July. I shall be speaking on trafficking in persons with particular reference to child labor. We need primarily to understand the aim of this presentation and the topics that I shall be dealing with. The aims of this presentation. We need to understand that why we want to carry out this presentation on trafficking in persons. Firstly, to raise an awareness in the public on trafficking in persons. Secondly, to educate citizens about potential threats to social harmony. And thirdly, to identify and respond to incidents of trafficking and report suspected cases to authorities. The topics that I'll be dealing with: firstly, what is the meaning of trafficking in persons? Secondly, what is the definition of child labor from an international perspective? Thirdly, what are the legal provisions for combating trafficking in persons, mainly child labor, in Mauritius? Finally, we need to look at selected provisions of the Combating Trafficking in Persons Act 2009 of Mauritius. Let's begin with the topic, the meaning of trafficking in persons. From the international perspective, it is recognized as a hidden crime. Its covert is not actually within the open. It is done behind closed doors, and it is not in the eyes of the public. That's why it's a hidden crime. Number two, trafficking in person involves controlling and exploiting people by forcing them into labor, services, or commercial sex acts. And accordingly, trafficking in persons would also mean that human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited. The next topic is, in our definition of terms, what is the meaning of trafficking? According to the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act 2009 of Mauritius, trafficking means the recruitment, sale, supply, transportation, or harboring of a person through threats, force, coercion, or deception. It also means the adoption of a person secured through illegal means for the purpose of exploitation. The word exploitation has been used earlier. We need to know its precise meaning according to the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act of 2009. According to this act, exploitation means all forms of slavery or practices similar to slavery, including forced marriage. Very interesting indeed that we have to know that even forced marriage is included as trafficking in person. The extended meaning of exploitation is again provided in the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act 2009. For instance, it is about sexual exploitation, including pornographic acts. It is also forced labor, which is imposed on the victims who are unwilling to perform certain acts, but they are actually coerced. They are forced to do certain act that is not acceptable to them, yet they have to perform. Next is about illegal removal of organs, which is obviously something very, very covert. It is not open. It is not known to the public. Because removal of organs, it is done in a way that has not got the public recognition. Therefore, it is an illegal removal of organs, is also regarded as exploitation. Coming to the topic, in the perspective, the context of trafficking in persons, we have chosen the topic child labor. We need to understand the entire perspective, its implication, and what does the consequences of child labor. First of all, according to the Workers' Rights Act of 2019 of Mauritius, we have defined who is a child. A child is a person under the age of 16, which means automatically that a person below the age of 16 is a child. Whenever we are giving work or any sort of assignment to a child who is below the age of 15, it is understood that he doesn't have the competence to understand the implication of an obligation of a contractual work. Therefore, a child under the age of 16 is considered a person who is not competent to understand the implications of work. Next is that, what is the definition of labor? It is the work carried out by individuals as determined by employers or exploiters for profit making. Two important words have been used here: employers or exploiters. Both of them have got the idea, the objective to make profit. Employers will be employing a child with the idea of making profit. And the worst kind of employers will be exploiters. So therefore, both employers and exploiters who are actually geared towards profit making and making the best out of a situation where their competency of a child is at question, then we may call it child trafficking. Coming next is the definition of child labor. Child labor is often defined as work that, number one, it deprives a child of livelihood, education, or free existence. It harms physical and mental development of a child. It causes excessive physical and psychological strain. Child labor lowers self-esteem and human dignity. It also involves exploitation of children for commercial purposes, criminal activities, armed conflict, or sex. Next, let's look at child labor from an international perspective. According to the International Labour Organization, ILO Convention number 182, child labor is described as slavery, sale, trafficking, debt bondage, forced labor, and compulsory recruitment of children to armed conflict. Under the international organization, which is United Nations International Children's Fund, UNICEF, also defines child labor as any work that exceeds a minimum number of hours and which is considered harmful to the child. In the same line, we need to know the guidelines provided by the UNICEF on exploitative child labor. What does it mean? It starts full-time work at an early age. Next, it's about working long hours outside the family environment. Thirdly, the children are separated from their family. Fourthly, they are exposed to hazards, illness, and lack of protection. And finally, they are left to fend for themselves on the street. There are other international instruments that regulate child labor. For instance, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989. We have next the International Labour Organization Convention number 138 of 1973 on minimum age. The next is the African Charter on the Rights of the Child. Having a look at the international perspective and what the international instruments have actually provided in the form of regulating exploitation or trafficking in persons, we come more specifically to the legal provisions that are provided in Mauritius to protect against exploitation. Section 10 of the Workers' Rights Act 2019 provides for competency to enter a work agreement at the age of 16. This has been mentioned already, that any person, any individual below the age of 15 is not competent to actually enter into a contractual work. Doesn't understand the implication, doesn't actually appreciate what are the rights and obligations. Therefore, Section 10 is very important in regulating and protecting against child labor. Section 6 of the Constitution of Mauritius, it's about protection from slavery and forced labor. Section 7 of the Constitution of Mauritius specifically provides for the protection from inhuman treatment. Now coming to more specific instances of the Act or statutory provision is the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act number 2 of 2009. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act number 2 of 2009 of Mauritius. The selected provisions to combat trafficking in person, especially exploitation of children, they are found in the following sections. Section 11 deals with consent of victims or control over a minor is not a defense to a charge of trafficking in persons. Then, Section 14 provides for a penalty of up to 15 years of penal servitude for such an offense. Coming to other sections now, other provisions, we have Section 16 that deals with compensation for victims of trafficking. It includes damage to or loss of property, including money. Next, physical or psychological injury or loss of income or support. To combat trafficking in persons, especially exploitation of children, Section 4 of the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act number 2 of 2009 provides for support services for setting up centers for victims of trafficking, such as securing the safety of the inmates, providing counseling and rehabilitation services. Next, facilitating the integration of inmates into their families. And finally, providing education, skills and development and training. After having spoken generally about the nature, the structure, and the concept itself of trafficking in persons, more specifically in Mauritius, and looking at the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act of 2009, we also have to look at what are the preventive measures that have been taken through the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act 2009 in order to provide relief, to give actually a sense of awareness, because that's the intention, that's the aim of this presentation. How do we actually try to combat trafficking in persons? And therefore, the sense of awareness that we need to create, maybe what we have to do, we have to establish a legal framework to implement whatever we have got as general policies. Like, for example, we have got the United Nations Protocol against trafficking in persons must be actually followed. Number two, the Act sets up mechanisms to enforce rules and regulations to combat trafficking, especially child labor in Mauritius. Next, in addition to the Child Protection Act, protection for children against trafficking, we have got two acts that are very instrumental in creating a secured environment for children. One is the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act 2009 and the Child Protection Act. In the course of this presentation, ladies and gentlemen, we have looked at the nature of trafficking in persons in terms of definitions, in terms of who is a child, in terms of what is a child labor. And we have also looked at the definition in terms of international perspective, from the UNICEF, from International Labour Organization, from the African Charter. All these have defined and put certain precision in what is meant by trafficking in persons, and more especially child labor. The intention is very, very important for us to understand why we have to create that awareness is actually ultimately to combat trafficking in persons. So how do we do it? We need your support. And what are the support that we need are the following. Number one, keep informed about trafficking in person, particularly reporting children's trafficking or child labor. Number two, we must get involved in national public awareness campaigns to educate the public, law enforcement agencies, and other industry partners. Thirdly, we must report any instances of trafficking in accordance with Section 13 of the Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act. Fourthly, we need to establish a social support system with the help of friends, family, and the community. Ladies and gentlemen, in the course of this presentation, we have mainly focused on the nature, the definition of trafficking in persons, which is today a very important topic that needs to create